Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our next lecture for Fundamentals of Music. The topic of the day is intervals. So I'm talking about intervals, meaning the distance between two pitches. So let's just take an example. Let's go ahead and throw up a treble clef staff, and let's add the note middle C. We could have a relatively large interval by going from C all the way up to, I don't know, maybe this E up here. So we start here, and we jump all the way up here. And we could say that that's a relatively large interval, both in terms of the actual distance it covers on the staff, as well as the actual, perceived difference in frequency. This sounds sort of like a relatively medium note. This sounds pretty high. We could contrast that with a relatively small interval. We could start on middle C and maybe we only go up to, this E. So these two pitches would be much closer, or even, something kind of in between. We could go from C up to G, which would sound like this. And we would have different sizes of intervals. And again, that's the definition I want you to really take forward from this, is that an interval is the distance between two pitches. And we can have relatively short and small distances, as well as relatively large or long distances between any given two pitches. We have numerical-based names to describe pretty much any interval, any distance between two pitches. For this lecture, we are going to stick with just the white keys on the piano and really just sort of stick with the notes of our C major scale. In the very near future, we will expand our definition of intervals to include some other options, but just to get us started, we're going to kind of work with this rudimentary set of terms that get us a strong foundation to help us build other more complex and more specific forms of intervals. So I'm going to start with just, once again, middle C. So here in my treble clef staff, I'm going to go ahead and start with middle C, and I'm going to say that the really smallest distance we could have would be really no distance at all. If we just had the same pitch, C, and then the next pitch is also middle C, we would just call that a unison, which makes sense because we really have covered no distance. But if we played C and then we played it again and we wanted to describe the relationship between those two identical notes, it's good to have a term like unison because we haven't really traveled any distance. If we were to go from C up to D, we would call that a second, because now we've moved from one to a second note. If we were to go from C up to E, you can imagine if I follow this pattern, we would call that a third. If we were to go from C to F, we would call that a fourth. C up to G would be an example of a fifth. I'll just move down here to save some space. C going up to A would be an example of a sixth. And C going up to B would be an example of a seventh. And as I've mentioned a little bit in the past, if we were to go to C all the way back up to another C, we would call that one octave. So as mentioned, we will have different flavors and slightly more specific versions of these intervals. So for example, we will have things like perfect fifths, we'll have major thirds and minor thirds and diminished fourths. We'll have some flavors that we add to these, but this system of terms, this sort of numeric nomenclature of unison, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and octave, that will stick with us no matter what, and we will never come across an interval that can't be described with one of these terms in some capacity or another. Now, something that's really cool to help you identify these, because a big part of what we are going to do going forward is interval identification. Much like key signatures or notes in the treble or bass clef staff, I need to be able to show you an interval and have you recognize it very quickly. So whether it is a second, third, fourth, fifth, etc., and as mentioned in the near future, we will add a bit more specificity to those. But if you can get the idea of the interval being the third or the fourth or the fifth or the sixth, if you can get that part right, you're always on a good track. So there's a really good visual trick that can help us identify whether we are dealing with one type of interval versus another. So let me show what I'm talking about. Let's add another little treble clef staff up here. And you'll notice that, for example, if I once again start on C, and if I were to have a distance of C up to D, which would be a second, and also if I had a distance of like C up to F, which would be a fourth, or if I had a distance of C up to A, which would be a sixth, or if I had C Going all the way back up to C, that would be an octave, or let's just call it an eighth to sort of stick with that nomenclature that I'm drawing up there for a second. You'll notice that each of these, 2, 4, 6, and 8, that those are all 4 even numbers in terms of describing our intervals, the second, the fourth, the sixth, and the octave / eighth. They're all even numbers. And there's a cool visual thing that's happening with the notes. You'll notice that in any instance where we have an even numbered interval, one of the notes is always on a line and another note is always in a space. So here C is on a line, but F is in a space. And here C is on a line and A is on a space. And here C is on a line and the next C is on a space. This is also true if we switch things around. So it doesn't always mean the first one is on the line and the next one's on a space. We could go another way around. So for example, if we started on the note F and if we wanted to go up a fourth, we would go F up to B, because like F, G, A, B, we're like 4 notes apart. You'll notice that this would be an example of a fourth. And you'll notice that once again, one note is in a space and the other is on a line. So this is a really quick way to immediately eliminate a good number of possible intervals. If you see any 2 notes, like if I show you this, if I show you, this G and this E, and I say, what interval is this? Well, because you can see that one of the notes, like this one, is on a line and the other is on a space, you can immediately identify that that is going to be an even numbered interval versus an odd numbered interval. So this cannot be a unison, it can't be a third, it can't be a fifth, and it can't be a seventh. It would have to be a second, fourth, sixth, or octave. And in this case, it does happen to be a sixth. And I'm going to recommend, as early as this week, but especially going into the next couple weeks as well as we expand on intervals, that you do either make some flashcards for yourself or hop on to musictheory.net, which again is linked on e-learning. There is some practice and some drilling that you can do for interval recognition, because you're going to have to get familiar with these and be able to really just see them and know what the distance is between those pitches. So for example, again, this G to C right here would be an example of a sixth. So even numbered intervals, one is always on a line, one is always on a space. It could be a space and then a line, or a line and then a space. It doesn't matter, but you're going to see that sort of spacing visually on the staff. You can imagine that this might also hold true for odd numbered intervals, but just with a slightly different visual pattern. So for example, if we start on C and we go up to E, this would be an example of a third, and you'll notice that they are both on lines. Or if we were to go to C to G, which would be an example of a fifth, you'll notice they are also both on lines. So if both notes are on lines, then it's going to be an odd numbered interval. Or if we were to go, let's say, from F to C, you'll notice both lines are on spaces. That's also an example of a fifth or an odd numbered interval. And we could expand that. We could go from like F all the way up to E, which would be an example of a seventh, and that's also going to be an odd numbered interval, but you'll notice both notes are also in spaces. Or we could go from like G to F, both lines also, both notes also on lines, and we get that seventh. So if you see any 2 notes and you are asked to identify the interval, this can be a great visual trick to look at first. Are both notes on a line or on a space? If so, it's an odd numbered interval. You're talking your third, your fifth, your seventh. Are they on a line and then a space, or a space and then a line? Then you're going to have your even numbered intervals. I still use that to this day just to quickly, sort of get my brain calibrated to what type of number I might be using to identify that interval. We sort of have 2 primary distinctions for how intervals occur over time in music. This doesn't change the distance of the interval itself, but it will require a slightly different label in context. What I'm talking about is the difference between what we would call harmonic intervals versus melodic intervals. A harmonic interval is going to look something like this, where I have a treble clef staff and maybe I have D and I also have A. We play them at the same time. In this case, that would be an example of a fifth, and it would sound like so. Okay, so it's harmonic, meaning they occur simultaneously. That is a harmonic interval of a fifth. To call it a melodic interval would simply be one and then the other. So we would hear. Right? So one is more like a melody, multiple notes in a row, and we're measuring the distance between them. A harmonic interval is simultaneous notes at once, which we will also eventually use to build chord structures. But again, this would be an example of that harmonic interval, which is a fifth. And then the exact same interval, but presented melodically, would sound as. Okay, so the interval doesn't change. That's still a fifth, but you'll notice that they occur over time in a different manner. Here it is simultaneously, and here it is one and then the other. So harmonic versus melodic interval, very important terms that we want to keep track of, and we want to make sure that whenever we're describing the distance between two pitches as an interval, we qualify whether that's melodic or harmonic, because this musically might function quite differently than this. Imagine if you're writing for the human voice. The human voice can't do this unless you're a Mongolian throat singer, in which case, more power to you, because that's really awesome. But generally speaking, we're talking about a melodic interval for like a melodic instrument to play something where it does one and then the other. All right, just to practice recognizing some harmonic intervals, I've given us just a few examples here to go through and identify. So again, if we wanted to, we could look at these pretty quickly and determine whether we are sticking with an even or odd number. So we can tell at a glance that, well, these are both on spaces, so it must be an odd numbered interval, versus over here, where we have one on a line and one on a space, so it must be an even numbered interval. We could continue over here. We have one in a space and another in a space. So again, it must be an odd numbered interval. Here we have one on a line, one on a space, so it must be even. And here we have both in spaces, so it must also be odd. So in terms of figuring these out and counting intervals, you have to be really diligent and careful how you count. And again, part of this is just practice, flashcards, drilling, memorization, and you will start to recognize these surprisingly quickly, and you do need to do that because you really don't want to have to count intervals every time. But as you're getting started, I would make sure you have your letters of your musical alphabet really solidified and your ability to recognize what those notes are on the musical staff. And here I have the note A, and then I have the note C. So if I'm unsure what distance that is, I mean, I will say right now that it is a third, and you'll get pretty quick at recognizing that any two adjacent spaces or adjacent lines are going to form a third. The way you can do it is you can think of A, B, and C. So count one for whatever note you start on, and then put up a finger for every note along the way, and however many fingers you have standing up at the end, well then you're at a third. So just to prove that example, here I have the note D, and then I have also the note E. So if I just counted upward one, I would go D and then E. So that would be a second. So that would be a second. What about over here? Here we have the note C and we have the note B. So I'm going to start on C and I'm going to go C, D, E, F, G, A, B. I'm going to have to hold up 7 fingers to get from C all the way up to B, so I could call that a seventh. And in this last example here, I have G, and then above I have C. So same thing, we could go G, A, B, and C, and you'll notice that we end up with 4 fingers up, and we would call that a fourth. And keep in mind, remember, our musical alphabet just continues. So I went from G right back to A, because that's how our cyclic musical alphabet works. Just to return to this interval right here of the seventh for 1 second, I'm going to redraw it, but I'll put it in a treble clef staff, and let's just go ahead and add a C and then a B. Generally speaking, once you get larger intervals, they kind of seemingly become harder to recognize right away because there's just a greater distance. You know, like over here, this is a third, and it just looks like a third. You know, they're just real close to each other. You start to recognize that distance. But like sixths and sevenths, sometimes at a glance, those seem like really far, and it's like, oh, do I really want to have to count all the way up and get to that? Well, if it's a large interval, you might try, instead of counting upward, count downward. And by that, I mean, look at this. Here we have C going up to B. Well, what if we had C going up to C? That would be an octave, or 8. And we notice that C is just one note up from B. So if the distance from C to C going up here is 8, well then C going up to this B has to be a seventh because it's one letter name fewer that we would have to count up. So sometimes with those larger intervals, don't count all the way up. Just go up an octave and work your way down from 8 and count to 7 or 6, and you're going to end up at that interval a little more quickly. If that works for you, cool. If it doesn't, you can always count from the ground up. I just want to make sure you're aware. Sometimes that helps. That's kind of how I approach large intervals. When I see them, I tend to think about, well, how far away from is it from being an octave? And in this case, C going up to B, well, it's just one note shy of an octave, so I can tell, well, that's a seventh at a glance. When it comes to identifying and labeling melodic intervals, it's really kind of the same idea. So here we have this little melody written out of. So we can still identify the intervals between any of these two notes just as if they were harmonic and stacked on top of each other. So we could look at the distance from C to E, and again, we can see that they are both on lines, so they are going to have to be an odd numbered interval. And again, we can just count C, D, E, and we can know that this would be an example of a third. We could see the distance from E to A, and again, here we can see that we have one on a line and one on a space, so it must be an even numbered interval. And again, we could just go E, F, G, A, and we would be able to label this as a fourth. Going forward, it's pretty easy to see what the interval is between the next several notes. We go from A to G, G to F, F to E, E to D, and D to C, and we can see that each one of those notes is adjacent to the letter next to it. We don't have any distance between. We go from one line to the very next space, or one space to the very next line, and we just continue that pattern. So every single one of these intervals would be a second. We could keep going from C up to B. Again, we could count. We could go like C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and we could realize that it is 7 fingers, so that this would be an example of a seventh. Or again, I could just think about this as like C going up to C, which would be an octave, and instead of thinking of it as going all the way up the octave, I could just think of C going up to B, which is one less, and therefore a seventh. That's how I tend to recognize sevenths very quickly. Here, once again, we just have B to A, so we're just moving down one letter, so that looks an awful lot like a second to me. Here we have A going down to E. Again, we have a note in a space versus a line, so we can imagine it will be an even number. And, if we don't want to count downward from A going down to E, we don't have to. We could just count from E going up to A, because it's relatively the same. I like to just count intervals from an ascending pattern, because otherwise I have to go through the alphabet backwards, and I'm still not great at that. So I could just say E, F, G, A, and I will get this labeled as a fourth. Whether it's going up or down, an ascending interval versus a descending interval, the distance does not change between the two notes. Just to demonstrate what I'm talking about, if I have E going up to A, that is a fourth, and if I have A going down to E, that is still a fourth. The relative up or down doesn't change between them. And then we finish with D going to E, which is a second because they are next to each other, and D going to C, also a second because they are next to each other. So that is going to be our introduction to intervals, and that is as far as we will go today. In our next module, we will add some qualifiers to these intervals, which will include perfect, major, minor, diminished, and augmented. And we will show that, for example, just to give you a taste of what's coming, the note C going up to E would be an example of a major third, but C going to E flat would be an example of what we call a minor third. So that's on the topic for the near future. Your work for this module will be identifying intervals just with these labels of unison, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, or seventh from both a melodic and harmonic standpoint.